Welcome to the 7th installment, believe it or not, of the Klein College's Graduate Speaker Series, COVID-19 version 2021. My name is Patrick Murphy. I'm the Associate Dean for Research and Graduate Studies, and I'm delighted that today we have the fortune of having our own Dr. Marc Lamont Hill share his work with us. Marc will be presenting two books, actually, recent publications. We Still Here, Pandemic, Policing, Protest, and Possibility, and Except for Palestine, The Limits of Progressive Politics. Let me tell you a little bit about these two books and then a little more about our speaker. We Still Here, Pandemic, Policing, Protest, and Possibility, is published by Haymaker Books, considers how the uprising of 2020 marked a new phase in the unfolding movement for Black lives. The brutal killings of Ahmaud Arbery, George Floyd, Breonna Taylor, and countless other injustices, large and small, were the match that lit the spark for the largest protest movement in US history, a historic uprising against racism and the politics of the disposability that the COVID-19 pandemic lays bare. Dr. Hill critically examines the pre-existing conditions that have led to this moment of crisis and upheaval, guiding us through both the perils and possibilities and helping us to imagine an abolitionist future. In his other book, Dr. Hill's Except for Palestine, The Limits of Progressive Politics, published by the New Press and co-authored with Mitchell Plitnick, Except for Palestine is a call for the American left to extend their politics to the issues of Israel-Palestine. The authors argue that progressives and liberals who oppose aggressive policies on immigration, racial justice, gender equality, LGBTQ rights, and other issues must extend these core principles to the oppression of Palestinians. In doing so, the authors take seriously the political concerns and well-being of both Israelis and Palestinians, demonstrating the extent to which US policy has made peace harder to attain. They also unravel the conflation of advocacy for Palestinian rights with anti-Semitism and hatred of Israel. A little bit about Dr. Hill. He is the Steve Charles Professor of Media, Cities, and Solutions at the Klein College of Media and Communication here at Temple University. And he is currently host of BET News and the Coffee and Books podcast. He is also the founder and director of the People's Education Center in Philadelphia, as well as the owner of Uncle Bobbie's Coffee and Books. He is an award-winning journalist and received numerous prestigious awards from the National Association of Black Journalists, GLAAD, and the International Academy of Digital Arts and Sciences. Ebony magazine named him as one of America's 100 most influential Black leaders. In addition to the books he's presenting today, Dr. Hill is author or co-author of 4 other books: the award-winning Beats, Rhymes, and Classroom Life, Hip Hop Pedagogy and the Politics of Identity, The Classroom and the Cell, Conversations on Black Life in America, Casualties of America's War on the Vulnerable from Ferguson to Flint to Beyond, and Gentrifier. He also published 2 edited books, Media, Learning, and Sites of Possibility, and Schooling Hip Hop, New Directions in Hip Hop-Based Education. Dr. Hill holds a PhD with distinction from the University of Pennsylvania. His research focuses on the intersections between culture, politics, and education in the United States and the Middle East. I mentioned that before turning the floor over to Dr. Hill that we will open things up after his talk for Q&A. You can submit your questions via chat and we can share those with Professor Hill. And also at the end, if you raise your hand, we'll try and identify you on the screen so that we can kind of keep it a nice flow. And with that, turn the floor over to you, Marc.
Thank you, Patrick. Thank you. And good morning, everyone. It is an honor to be part of this series and an honor to see so many people here this morning as we talk about what I think are some incredibly important issues at this moment. I've spent the last 5 years actually last 7 years, doing field work on two empirical projects. One has been looking at how people use media to think about and narrate their own lived experiences with state violence, both in the United States and in Jerusalem. And I've also been doing field work in East Jerusalem, thinking about how race operates, particularly the racialization of Afro-Palestinians in East Jerusalem. And at every moment, as I'm beginning to write and do the ethnographic sort of writing process after years of field work, there's a crisis that interrupts the field work, and I end up writing or working on a text that helps me make sense of the moment that we're in. I think about writing as a form of inquiry as much as it is one of discovery. I think about the process of engaging in ethnographic writing as helpful for me as much as it is for my peers and my colleagues as I try to make an intellectual intervention, but also cultural criticism, journalism. These are all tools and methods that I attempt to use to make sense of the world. And the book that I'm supposed to be talking about, and talking about two books in like 30 minutes and time for questions will be a daunting task, but I'm up to it. I'm from North Philly. I've done more with less. But I want to start with We Still Here, because that's a project that I have that sort of emerged in the summer very quickly, quite frankly. And it was an extension of, again, some of the field work that I was doing, but I wanted to think critically about the moment that we were in. As you all know, we entered a pandemic somewhat surprisingly, somewhat unexpectedly in the winter. And I was working on other projects, and like everyone else, I was in my home trying to figure out how to make sense of the moment, trying to survive, trying to get water, trying not to get COVID. And I began to think about some of the issues that were emerging at that juncture in history. And one of those things were the media images that we were sort of bombarded with as people were being told to stay at home, to observe social distance, et cetera. And one of those images was a Black person, a group of Black people in North Philadelphia outside at a basketball court. Another image were people hanging on a corner in West Philly. And the media representations were such that whether it was local news in Philadelphia or whether it was national news around the country, what we saw was the idea that these people were either unwilling or unable to comply with health statutes, that these people were being grossly irresponsible, and this was the reason why COVID continued to spread. So once again, the vulnerable were being scapegoated for what was really a structural problem. And that media representation, for me, speaks to a deeper problem that I get at in the book, which is two things. One, the individualization of a structural crisis, right? And once again, the disposability of the vulnerable. COVID, we're in a moment, and sort of the theoretical apparatus that I use to frame this book is one that talks about how we are in a moment where neoliberal logics govern how we respond to social crises. I talk about the emergence of COVID capitalism, or Corona capitalism, excuse me. And Corona capitalism speaks to the particular ways, the particular structural arrangements, institutional arrangements, logics of capital that allow for the vulnerable to be more susceptible to premature death. It also speaks to the particular ways that the powerful, and when I say the powerful, I'm speaking specifically of multinational corporations and the 1%, are able to capitalize off crisis, able to capitalize off disaster, what Naomi Klein would call disaster capitalism, in such a way that they increase their wealth and are able to control and overdetermine the life outcomes of the vulnerable. And so when we see the image of the Black person on the corner, that's not just the sort of demonization and pathologization of Black folk. It speaks to a deeper issue where we tend to individualize a structural problem at the same time that we attempt to universalize a particular problem. And I'm going to talk about what those two things mean. The first thing is universalizing a particular problem means that the narratives in corporate media, the narratives in everyday talk, when COVID first hits, is we're all in this together. The idea that we are all in this together is the way that we attempt to universalize a problem that has very structurally specific ramifications and consequences for people. We saw this after 9/11. We're all in this together now. Everyone is hated. Everyone is subject to random violence. Everyone is unsafe. Everyone is unprotected. But there were a whole bunch of Black folk in America, a whole bunch of South Asians in America, a whole bunch of Sikh folk, a whole bunch of Muslims, a whole bunch of Arabs who would say, well, one, we've always felt like this, but two, that there's a particular way that laws and policies are being shaped that impact us disproportionately. And similarly, what we're seeing in COVID is not so much a government target as we saw in the other case, but rather a set of structural conditions that makes Black and brown people, that makes working poor people more susceptible to COVID-19. But because we make it a universal problem, then what happens is we're able to then individualize the consequences. In other words, we're able to say, well, the way to not get COVID is to socially distance. The way to get COVID is to wash your hands. The way to get COVID is to wear a mask. For all of you people out there, you should do all of those things. You should wear a mask. You should social distance. You should wash your hands. This is not me saying you shouldn't do those things. I do it. I've had COVID. I've had 2 vaccine shots, and I still wear my mask all the time. I'm in a hotel room by myself, and I'm about to put my mask back on. So wear the mask. However, by framing it as an individual problem, we let ourselves off the hook of state accountability. What does that mean? It means that we have to think about the ways that the vulnerable are incapable. In other words, we have to think about how social, let me back up. We have to think about how social distance is an index of privilege and access and power. Social distance isn't merely an individual choice. And when we look at the analysis of who's getting COVID and who's not, what we see is that frontline workers, those not just people who are considered essential personnel in the sense of police or medical staff, but people who are working the lines at Target, people who are working at the big box retailer, people who are delivering for Amazon. These are people who don't have the luxury of social distance. Again, social distance becomes an index of privilege to some extent. The fact that we can give a fancy university lecture right now on a Friday with 104 people here, which is amazing. It's because we can work from home, we can Zoom. And so when the media narrative that attaches those kids sitting on the corner or standing across the street emerges, it neglects the fact that that corner might actually be the safest place. Because if I'm living in North Philly in a home that's 600 square feet with 4 people in it, that actually might not be the safest place. So the idea of social distancing is itself an index of economic privilege, but also the power of whiteness. There is a long and deep history of not only the powerful, the economically powerful, but white people also being able to construct neighborhoods, sectors, and communities that are exclusionary in such a way that now there is social distance. Being able to work from home is all we talked about, being able to have private modes of transportation, being able to live in gated communities. These are all measures of distance that are not accessible to other folk. At the same time, so I'm going to move quickly. There's a lot to cover. The second piece of this that I want to talk about is the media and journalistic narrative of the guy selling sanitizer. And this is one of the most interesting and complicated stories that we saw in media around March or April. We would hear the story of an individual citizen who bought 50 bottles of hand sanitizer and 1,000 PPE, and then they were selling the $2 hand sanitizer for like a gajillion dollars, to use the technical term. And that is true. There were 1 or 2 people who made that choice. There are 1 or 2 people who benefited from this. But by framing the individual who exploits the system at this moment, we ignore the fact that there are systems and structures in place and corporations in place that were able to exploit that work at those resources at a far greater rate. I'm pulling up the numbers here as my computer just blanked on me. Yes. So when the FBI and other government agencies, as well as with no irony at all, Amazon said, we are going to partner to make sure that no one exploits the system, we are looking at a very bizarre set of logics that are part and parcel of, again, what I refer to as Corona capitalism. At that moment where 20 million people become unemployed, billionaire wealth increases by 10% in April. When we look at Amazon, a company like Amazon, which we already know pays very little in taxes, they reported $280 billion in total revenue and $13.9 billion in pre-tax income. The company only had to pay $162 million in taxes. This is the backdrop before we even get to Corona capitalism. Amazon earns tax breaks by accepting SNAP, that's Supplemental Nutrition Assistance Program subsidies, from customers, while its employees are among the top food stamp recipients in numerous states around the country. Again, this is all before COVID-19. And so what happens is we then see a system that already has bolstered corporations, rendered them too big to fail. And then when something like COVID happens, it's not that there's some big conspiracy of corporations that knew COVID was coming. It's that there are structures and systems in place that allow them to thrive while the poor are unable to. And then the government intervention that happens, which again is a big part of the story, it comes through a $2 trillion CARES Act, which gives $500 billion to Wall Street. It gives PPP loans to small businesses. But many of the small businesses who got the loans were actually not small businesses. One of the biggest small businesses that received funds during Corona capitalism was Shake Shack. Imagine, and you all know Shake Shack because there are 6,000 of them. There are literally 6,000 Shake Shacks, and yet they were rendered a small business and were given PPP loans, the same PPP loans that a mom and pop store would get. Now, they returned their money. They were somehow shamed into returning the money. But the idea here is that they received it in the first place. So we're looking at a system that, again, has scapegoated the powerful at the expense of the vulnerable. Another image, and again, I'm moving quickly so that we can get through 2 books. Another media image we saw was the Andrew Cuomo, narrative was the Andrew Cuomo liberatory narrative, right? There was a sharp juxtaposition of Andrew Cuomo versus Donald Trump in really from March until June, showing Andrew Cuomo as the extraordinary leader who was able to direct the state at the same time that Donald Trump was driving the nation in the wrong direction. This was the media narrative. I'm not making a political claim about either. I mean, not that I'm afraid to, as you all know, but it's just not the point at the moment. There's a moment here where Andrew Cuomo does this by talking about getting the people who are incarcerated in New York State prisons to make PPE and hand sanitizer, right? And it's the very same moment. New York State prisons are 5.5 times more likely to produce COVID positive people than anywhere else in the nation. And so there's a kind of cruel irony of talking about the incarcerated citizen who has to make PPE but can't wear any, who has to make hand sanitizer but can't use any. And so part of what I get at in the book, and this is a conceptual argument, is around the politics of disposability, right? This idea that there are populations within the United States that are rendered disposable because of their inability, or the state's inability to extract capital from them. And 2 people that I frame in the book are the elderly and the incarcerated, because the dominant logic is these are people who are disposable. When people die in nursing homes, you say, well, they're old, they were supposed to die anyway. And when people are in prison, they say, oh, well, these are bad people and bad people are supposed to die anyway. And so what we saw in both cases was an extraordinary amount of elderly folk, and we're seeing more in the news stories, which I don't want to get into, but in the news stories around Andrew Cuomo more recently, among other news stories about Andrew Cuomo, was the number of elderly people who died in nursing homes during this time that went unreported or underreported. But part of how this happens, again, is because there's a sense that the state should be able to make these decisions about who should die and who's not. And these determinations were made with regard to who should get ventilators, who should get PPE, and even returning people to nursing homes when they were still COVID positive. This is all part of what Mbebe calls a necropolitics, or the state's decision or determination to exact a certain kind of power over who lives and who dies. And again, at this moment of Corona capitalism, we've decided that the vulnerable are eligible, are death eligible, if it means opening up the American economy again. I'm going to pivot to the other half of the book, which gets at the spectacles of violence. At the same time that we are dealing with a pandemic, we also witnessed the brutal killing of Ahmaud Arbery. We watched the brutal killing of George Floyd. We were forced to sort of wrestle with the narratives around Breonna Taylor. We didn't see Breonna Taylor die, but we understood the narratives. And we even watched Christian Cooper harassed in Central Park while he was bird watching, as if there were a less threatening figure in the world than a Harvard graduate bird watcher in Central Park on Memorial Day. And yet even he earned a certain kind of threat, either violence or at least the threat of violence from Amy Cooper. And so part of what the book gets at in the second half are these spectacles of death and the role that these spectacles of death play. There's a long history in using the process of journalism, the act of journalism, the act of storytelling, of media making, to narrate and sort of play out spectacles of death. And what I'm wrestling with in the text, and I'd love to have conversations, particularly with those of you who are in journalism, is sort of the ethical tensions and contradictions around these kinds of engagements. When you put on Twitter, you're confronted with the death of Ahmaud Arbery, you're confronted with the death of George Floyd, sometimes even if you don't expect it. And there's a way that that can serve one of two functions. On the one hand, it can allow us to think deeply about the urgency of state violence, the gruesomeness of state violence. Ida B. Wells Barnett did this with lynchings in the 20th century, that if we saw Black people hanging from trees, if only we could see it, the state would respond differently. Martin Luther King used this as part of his strategy on the Pettus Bridge, right? That if we could dramatize the violence, that if America could see nonviolent protesters being beaten, that perhaps we could get a different response from liberal America. The idea of having an open casket funeral for Emmett Till, when he gets killed and thrown in Chattahoochee River in 1955, the idea that Mamie Till would have an open casket funeral where this teenage boy's head was 3.5 times its normal size, it was disfigured, was that America would have a different response. And that leads to the Birmingham boycotts, the bus boycotts of 55, the Montgomery bus boycotts of 55. This is all happening because there's a logic to the spectacle of violence. But the question becomes, at this juncture of hyper attentiveness and hyper media and the sort of ubiquitousness of digital media, what does it mean to see Black bodies murdered at all times? Does it serve a different purpose? Does it serve to re-traumatize those watching it? Does it serve to objectify the Black body? Does it serve to normalize spectacles of violence such that you just see another Black person dying again? This becomes part of the tension, part of the contradiction that I'm wrestling with in the book. And in the book, you know, it's not a novel, it's not like there's a spoiler, but what I ultimately, I'd like you all to kind of think through the argument a little bit with me, and when you read the book, but the bulk of what I'm getting at here is that we should reconsider the use of these kinds of spectacles of violence as the means of exacting justice because of the long-term trauma and re-traumatization that is happening to those who are watching, particularly around kind of the visualization of Black death. The book goes into some other directions. It's a short book, but it's a lot of topics. But those are kind of the big ideas that I want us to think about. And ultimately, I see the book as an abolitionist text. Ultimately, this book is rooted in a vision and a politics of abolition. There is a long tradition of abolition in the United States, initially the abolition of slavery, but at this juncture in history, it's about the abolition of police and the abolition of prisons. This is an idea, this is a movement that has emerged and expanded since the death of George Floyd. In Minnesota, they voted to defund police. We've seen conversations around the defunding of police. And for some, that's an abolitionist move. That's a proto-abolitionist move. For others, it is sort of compromising it's a kind of political purity of an abolitionist posture. But in either case, there's a conversation to be had here about how can we imagine a world without policing and prisons. The final essay in the book forces us to think through those things. I'm very clear and upfront that that this book is rooted in the Black radical tradition. It's rooted in the work of radical Black feminists who have attempted to articulate versions of the radical imagination that are far more ambitious even than their male counterparts. The radical imagination, or the abolitionist imaginations I talk about, is rooted first in a radical freedom dream, the ability to imagine worlds that are not yet. Adam Katachu has a wonderful new book. It came out about a year ago now. It's called World Making After Empire. And part of what she's getting at is that the most powerful freedom fighters of the 20th century were not fighting to simply rebuild or reshape empire. They weren't trying to nation build, right? When you think about Kwame Nkrumah in Ghana, when you think about even what King was doing here, the idea wasn't to rebuild empires, it was to world make, to imagine and fashion new worlds of possibility that were not yet, that were based on democratic principles and equality across the entire human family. That's the fundamental idea. And for me, the abolitionist imagination begins there. It begins by saying not just what we don't want, which is policing and prisons, but to assert an affirmative vision of the world that we do want to see. I'll give you one concrete example before I pivot to the very simple topic of Israel-Palestine for 5 minutes. There is, right when this book came out, Walter Wallace was killed in West Philadelphia. He was holding a knife. And the debates around his death were, should the police have shot him or not? His mom calls the police. He's having what she called a psychotic episode, or what they call a psychotic episode. He's holding a knife. He's moving toward the police shoot him. And of course, people said, well, look, if a guy's running at me with a knife, I'd shoot him too. Other people said, no, the police should have exercised more restraint. These are the terms of the conversation within carceral logic. What I'm suggesting is the abolitionist imagination begins from an earlier place. It asks a more fundamental question of, what would the world look like if our needs were being met? So that we don't start from the place of the police arriving with and deciding what to do with the guy with the knife. And again, we'd all probably make all sorts of decisions if somebody's charging us with a knife and we had a gun in our hands. It's part of why, I wouldn't be staying there as a police officer with a gun in my hand. But the abolitionist imagination begins not just by saying we don't want police on the scene, by saying, what would the world look like if we had institutions that were designed to meet Walter Wallace's mental health needs long before he's on the scene right there? What would the world look like if his mother had someone to call when her baby's, or her grown man, but her baby, Black mamas, her baby's having a mental health breakdown? What would it mean for her to be able to call someone other than an armed police force? But the problem is, if the only tools we have is a hammer, then everything will look like a nail. All of our responses are carceral because that's what we have. If someone is drug addicted, we call the police. If a cat is stuck in a tree, we call the police. If someone has an overdose, we call the police. If there's a domestic dispute, we call the police. If someone is scared, they call the police. And so what we have to do is imagine new possibilities and new futures that force us to reimagine our role, our own sociality. That part of what capitalism has done, late capitalism has done, is that it's de-skilled us in terms of our own social interactions and our own social engagement. So we've outsourced much of these things to law enforcement. How could we imagine new possibilities? And what COVID has taught us, what this crisis has given us a window to, are sort of portals to new possibilities, to alternative worlds. We said we couldn't decarcerate prisons, but the moment COVID hit, some prisons let out the elderly because they wanted to protect the guards. They said we can't excarcerate, we can't decriminalize drugs. And yet, when everyone had COVID, police said, maybe we shouldn't lock up this guy with a bag of drugs in his pocket. Maybe we can let him go. When it's in the state's interest, we were able to do it. We've had a reparations debate for decades that they said, we'll never figure out where to find the money. We won't figure out how to distribute it to people. We can't make lists. How do we do it? This is impossible. And then when the American Capitalist Project was on the line, we were able to find $2 trillion to bail out corporations. So the idea here is that the state has tipped its hand. The abolitionist imagination is fertile, and we are able, right at this juncture in history, to imagine new worlds and new possibilities toward victory. And that's what I'm trying to get us to think about in the book. And as media folk, those of us who study media, those of us who work in the media, part of what we have to do is allow our media representations, the stories that we tell, to be informed by this kind of critical analysis, so that when we put the kid on the corner in North Philly standing outside across the street in a basketball court, and they're saying, look at these kids, they just love basketball so much they'll get COVID for it. We rather instead say, what does it mean to have a social housing crisis such that people can't live at home safely? When we talk about people, when we're telling the story about hand sanitizer, we have to be able to tell the story in such a way that we talk about how screwed up it is that someone would exploit the working class people by selling hand sanitizer for $50. We should have that critique, but it should be against the backdrop of a broader structural critique that has rendered private hospitals vulnerable and public hospitals even more vulnerable, that has made nursing homes and prisons even more imperiled. We have to look at it against the backdrop of a multinational corporation like Tyson Foods, which has 10,000 people get COVID, and they keep chicken production going, and don't have a healthcare policy for their workers. We have to be able to have that conversation too. Otherwise, we scapegoat the poor. We can have the conversation about spectacles of violence, right? But we have to have a real critique, not just of what it means to be rebelling or rioting and having that sort of tired debate, but having a broader critique of what Weber talks about around absolute violence in the states of capacity to not demand nonviolence, but to demand a monopoly of violence. We have to be able to have those kinds of rich, interesting conversations around what's happening. And if we do that, we can produce better media. We can have more smart journalism. We can have more engaged citizens. We can tell deeper stories. I'm going to talk for just very, very quickly on the other book, because I've given a million talks on the other book, and they're very available. But this other book that I wrote, some of you may know, I've been trying to sort of keep it quiet. I've been somewhat secretive about this, but I have a strong position on Israel-Palestine. And I wanted to write a text that forces us, along with my co-author, Mitchell Plitnick, to think about where the American progressive movement is at this time. When I'll give you just two quick examples, and then I'll take questions. Actually, let me back up. In the activist movement, there's long been something called the PEP, right? The PEP is the person who's progressive except for Palestine. This is the person who, you know, supports all the stuff that we support on the left. Whether you consider yourself progressive or radical or just liberal, you know, if you're left of center, there's some stuff that we probably all agree on. And then oftentimes the question of Palestine becomes a dividing line. It becomes a fissure. It becomes a space where people may have contradictions between sort of the politics the values that they articulate and their position on this question. And so what we wanted to do in this text was sort of sift through the hows and the whys, not to castigate people for that position, not to demonize people for that position, but to say, what are the sets of policies that have been instituted and normalized that have made this sort of denial of the freedom and self-determination of Palestinian people to be a bipartisan project. We begin the book by thinking about Donald Trump at the border, talking about the border, talking about migrant caravans, talking about shooting people with rubber bullets, calling people rapists and thieves, and people being outraged by it, people being outraged by the stripping away of the social safety net here in the United States. And at the very same moment, UNRWA, the United Nations Relief Works Agency, is completely cut off from US funds. That means that Palestinian children won't get food, won't get education, won't get housing. And there was not a peep. How does that happen? We want to wrestle with that. And we wrestle with it in some very key ways. First of all, we begin by saying that this is not the product of some conspiracy. This is not the product of some cabal of power. There's so many deeply disturbing and morally repugnant anti-Semitic narratives that have been used to make sense of this circumstance, this political circumstance. And we begin by saying, out of hand, that's not what we want. We also begin by saying that it's not our job as Americans, as non-Israelis, as non-Palestinians, to decide what the future of the region is. That's up to the people there to decide. I have my own perspective on what that should be. I have my own philosophical beliefs about what that should be, but that's not what the book is about. Our only goal is to create a world of lasting and enduring peace where Jews and Arabs, where Israelis and Palestinians can both live in safety, peace, dignity, justice, and self-determination without exception. That is where we begin and that is where we end. That must be the only non-starter for us, right? But we want to figure out the hows and the whys of how we got here. And so we wrestle with four key issues. One is the question of the right to exist. What does it mean to demand, to affirm the right to exist? How does that emerge as a political question, as a philosophical question? And why is it a question that's only presented to the Palestinians and no other population around the globe? But what are some of the reasons why that question is deemed to be necessary? The second thing we get at is the question of boycott, divestment, and sanctions. You know, how does a boycott movement emerge, and how do we have members of Congress like Senator Cory Booker, who will literally say, we have to create laws to protect corporations and governments from boycotts. On the question of BDS, not on the question, imagine him saying that about Hobby Lobby or Walmart or Chick-fil-A, right? It would be unimaginable. But what are the policy arrangements? What are the decisions that have been made? What are the philosophies that have shaped his thinking and others thinking on this issue, such that, again, it becomes a consensus bipartisan issue? We raised the question of Trump, right? And then when we wrote this book, Donald Trump was president, and I'll be honest with you, we wrote the book assuming there'd be 8 years of Trump. We very quickly sketched out a Biden preface on November 6th, right before it went to press, or November 8th, excuse me. But the question of Trump was, or the issue around Trump was that Trump has been framed again as the boogeyman on Middle East policy. Trump has been framed as someone who has been out of step with American policy. And there are moments where he has, for example, recognizing the Golan Heights is sort of a bizarre outlier, right? But in general, what Trump has done is simply be a more aggressive and articulate iteration of American policy. He's American policy on steroids. I'll give you an example. One of the most controversial moves that Donald Trump did was in 2018, he moved the US Embassy from Tel Aviv to Jerusalem, which contravenes international law by most estimations, and he's one of a few nations to do this. Most nations have said, we're not going to do that because Jerusalem is contested and it's a final status issue. And so people say, oh my God, Donald Trump is a monster. He moved the embassy. And yes, I would, no extra charge for this, I would say Donald Trump is a monster. However, when we look at the policy implications of this, the Jerusalem Embassy Act was actually signed in 1995 during the Clinton presidency. It was an act that Clinton did not sign, but he did not veto. He was under pressure from the right to do so. The right and the left agreed that this is something we should do. And every American president since 1995 has actually had to sign a waiver not to move the embassy. And that waiver is renewed every 6 months. So essentially, since 1995, the embassy was supposed to be moved to Jerusalem. Donald Trump is the first person not to sign the waiver, but he didn't introduce the policy. And no American president has opposed the policy. Now Joe Biden is president, and he's saying, I'm not moving the embassy back. This is an example of how American policy in many ways has been bipartisan in its disposition toward the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. And then finally, we talk about Gaza. The Gaza Strip is one of the most beleaguered and sort of, there are a few instances of human rights disasters like what we see in Gaza, whether it's lack of electricity, lack of access to employment, whether it's being an open air prison, whether it's the fact that there's no potable water. Human rights organizations predicted that it would be uninhabitable by 2020. And by all indices, it is. And of course, we're in 2021. And so what we try to do is help us think through how we get to a place like this in Gaza and how we have not gotten the response from human rights organizations around the globe. And so each text, each chapter is rooted in a kind of history of these movements, rooted in a history of these analyses, of these policy debates. But again, our goal in the text is not to assert a final status position. Our goal in this text is to analyze the history of this, to talk about the kind of tensions and contradictions on the American left around why this has happened, and to point a kind of way, and to point to the trajectory of where we think American left-wing politics is going on the question of Israel-Palestine. And as American taxpayers and as a scholar of the Middle East, it was important for me to write this text right now because I think there's an important opportunity to intervene. And while we focused on American policy, we could have had the same conversation around the American Academy. We could have had the same conversation around what it means to be for American academics to be progressive on every issue but Palestine, to support boycotts or to support free speech except for Palestine. We could talk about what it means in state legislatures where you can, in the Texas school board, you have to sign a waiver saying you won't be part of a boycott of Israel if you're going to be a school teacher in many cities. These are the types of decisions that people have to make, which in many ways, which would be unimaginable on any other issue. And so we want to think through and help others process why. And that's it. And just in terms of the future work, I have 2 projects that I'm working on right now, both of which are empirical projects. I'm finishing an ethnographic study called Folostini, Falastini is that's Arabic for Palestinian. It might be obvious, but it's a book about sort of how Afro-Palestinians in East Jerusalem navigate race, identity, and citizenship, and thinking about how they are become racialized subjects, and also how they navigate anti-Blackness within the context of the state. That is racializing them not for being Afro-Palestinian, but simply for being Falastini, or being Palestinian, whatever that means. And then, of course, there's another project I'm working with Todd Brewster, who briefly taught here at Temple, wonderful guy, a brilliant journalist. And we're working on a book called Black and White, which will be out next May, which is looking at the use of media technology, phone technologies, and social media how those technologies helped advance the fight for racial justice from the moment of George Floyd until now. We're essentially trying to look at how what he calls people power through digital media has allowed us to form a radical resistance movement in 2021. And so each chapter is looking at a different piece of media technology and a media strategy, from doxing to well, anyway, I don't want to get too far in that, but so there are other projects on the way. So hopefully I'll be invited back, and I'll be smart enough to just do one book at a time, and we can have a conversation. But I know we have about 20 minutes for Q&A, and I'm looking forward to talking to folk and hearing from folks. So, and again, just thank you all for inviting me. Thank you all for being such a wonderful intellectual community. I've been here now for 4 years almost, and I couldn't be happier to be part of Klein College and to be part of a community of wonderful and generous colleagues. I'm incredibly grateful for you all. And I'm incredibly grateful to Steve Charles for creating the chair in Media, Cities, and Solutions, which has allowed me to do media work and to participate in media making, to think about what it means to do that in the context of urban America and abroad, but also to be really committed to solutions and solutions journalism. And I'm very excited about the projects that are coming out. Of course, the Todd Brewster project is a solutions journalism project, which has me incredibly excited to share with you all. And I look forward to the dialogue.
Thank you, Marc, for your presentation, weaving together what sound like really exciting books. I'd like to open this up. We are accepting questions through chat, and we can also open up some microphones so you can put up a yellow hand and we'll identify you. But Mia, if we have any questions, go ahead and let those through to both Marc and myself. And let's go ahead and start with Andreas, if you want to jump in the question. We can unmute you.
I think I'm unmuted.
Okay,
now.
there you go.
Thank you very much, first of all, Professor Hill, for this presentation. I'm wondering if you can talk about what the role of global media is in the portrayal of Americans, but also specifically marginalized communities in the United States, Black Americans during this pandemic. And because you touched on the reporting within the United States, but I was just wondering how media outlets like Reuters contribute to a certain narrative.
Yeah, no, it's a great question. And I, honestly, I haven't studied, I haven't done any sort of systematic inquiry into global media, because I was so focused on sort of how US media covered this. But when I think about global media in the context of other crises, whether it's 9/11, whether I think Hurricane Katrina might be a better example when we think about kind of racialized discourses. What we saw from global media in many ways was an erasure of the vulnerable, particularly around Black and Brown populations. We saw very little reporting that spoke to the specific populations that were being harmed in New Orleans, and we saw even less of a kind of racialized analysis. And so so the idea of Americans just meant white, writ large, and that was part of the crisis. But again, how the pandemic has been covered, I honestly, I've only focused on US media for this particular project, and so I can't say with any sort of empirical certainty.
Thank you. Professor Rodriguez.
Yeah, thank you, Patrick. And thank you, Mark. I mean, I'm so impressed you did 2 books in 40 minutes.
Not well, but I did my best.
That's excellent. My question is about what you said in terms of what would the world look like if the institutions responded to our needs. So I grew up in Latin America in the 60s, 70s, and I'm very used to a discourse where we assume that, of course, capitalism is not the solution. And we can imagine something outside of capitalism, and we can talk about, and it's kind of mainstream among progressives, in academic circles, activist circles, to talk about imagining a world outside of capitalism and actually trying to destroy capitalism or find another option. And it always shocks me, even though I've been here more than 25 years, the barrier among even very progressive people to question the value of capitalism. And I wanted to ask you if this resonates with your own experience going to the Middle East and on many other parts of the world, and how you deal with it.
Yeah, no, it's a great question, and absolutely, I have found this to be the case. There, I think it was Jameson who said, it is easier for people to imagine the end of the world itself than to imagine the end of capitalism. And that, in many ways, is the struggle I also have as an abolitionist. People can imagine a world ending; they can't imagine a world without prisons. So part of what we have to be able to do is to nurture that radical imagination, to hatch new freedom dreams and new possibilities. Because one of the most bizarre sort of contradictions of capitalism becomes that even that the people who are the most vulnerable are the ones believing in it, right? And the ones who have a sort of undying, unwavering faith in it. I mean, you look at people who are voting against the inheritance tax, they call the death tax in the United States. People who make, $7, $8 an hour are saying, yes, but if I get that $10 million, I want to be able to pass that wealth on. But not thinking about the fact that those taxes right now would actually help them in their circumstance. When you think about the people who vote for the Bush tax cuts or the Trump tax cuts, these are often people who won't benefit from them economically. And part of why that is because of sort of the logic of capitalism. Part of it also is the racialization of poverty in the United States, right? It's that we think of the poor as being Black and brown folk. And so the bulk of people who are the beneficiaries of these policies, which are, for example, in the case of welfare, young white women are often thinking they're voting against Taquanda from North Philly's projects rather than Wendy or Becky from West Virginia, to play on the kind of racialized stereotypes that the media presents to us. Traveling abroad, you're right. There's a sense that the center can hold oftentimes, not in every place, obviously. Again, we see nation building as much as we see world making. In fact, more so the former. But there are sites of possibility in other struggles and in other social arrangements that allow us to imagine new futures, new possibilities, new selves, new worlds. And when we do work here, the most significant work we do, I think, is political education. And that's why I say that first book is an abolitionist text, because part of what I want to do is get people to understand the fundamental contradictions of where we are. One of the important slogans that has emerged in the last couple of years is that we have to stop saying that the system is broken and we want to make it work, but rather we say the system is working just as it's designed, and we have to break it. And there are moments like the pandemic where I have seen the site of possibility, where I think communities are seeing the site of possibility. They're beginning to reimagine what a social safety net looks like. When you get a stimulus check, although it's really a tax sort of rebate or tax credit, when people got that first check, they began to think about the possibilities of what a nation could be if they took care of its citizens during a moment of crisis. What would it mean for a small business not to have to open in the middle of a health pandemic in order to live or survive? We began to have these conversations, and I do see the tide turning. I do see critiques of capitalism that are emerging from everyday people, but unfortunately, capitalism is very malleable. It's very durable, and these narratives persist in such a way that people very quickly stop thinking about how to dismantle this system, but how to reform it in a way that just makes them greater beneficiaries of it. And I think it's been the biggest struggle I've had as an activist. It's the biggest struggle I've had as an organizer, is to convince people, as the World Social Forum says, that other worlds are indeed possible. And I'm no longer optimistic that we'll be successful in that struggle. And I don't know if that's just the older you get, the more cynical you get, or if this is rooted in something more theoretically, rich. But that's sort of how I'm thinking about it right now.
I want to call on a couple of people with their hands up, but I want to ask a quick question because I think it dovetails on exactly what Clemencia asked, Marc, and maybe less ambitiously, but I think an interesting thing is that we have a history, we being the United States, in as far as I can remember, of electing people to serve in government who don't believe in government. To what extent does that sort of fit into your, this idea of reimagining these sort of power politics and thinking about things like what you sort of touched on, which is just having services instead of calling the police for every need we have, having other kinds of responses available, because we imagine a better or different kind of way in which government serves the people.
Yeah, I think there's two pieces there, and I think one, right, we have, given certain configurations of power, how electoral politics works, and how much of it is driven by big money, we're often left with two not equally, that's not fair, but two undesirable choices. And we're often choosing between two undesirable choices. And so I think part of what this reimagining is to say, how can we imagine political systems? How can we imagine electoral politics in new ways, right? Where we're not bound to two parties or bound to two very narrow slices of political ideology. Because you're right, we continue to elect people who don't believe very much in government, or they believe in government in very narrow ways, military, right? Maybe roads. They don't believe in social democracy except for corporations, right? We'll invest in corporations so that they're too big to fail, but no one else. But I think the other piece of it is about having a new social imagination. Part of what the logic, it's not just destroying the prison, it's destroying its imprint, its ideological imprint. We are driven typically through the logic of saying, and in this way, I want to be, and it's a great question, Patrick, and it takes me in many directions, but in many ways, I want to pull the state out as well. I think the government should be there as a safety net, but in terms of our social interactions, there's ways that we bring the state into our conflicts where we don't need to. That's precisely what happens when I do harm to you, Patrick, or let's say Patrick does harm to me. I like that example better. Patrick, let's say you steal my TV, right? Carceral logic says I now need to exact some sort of revenge or punishment on you. And if I call the police, the state intervenes not to resolve our conflict, but to criminalize you for the harm you've done. And now it becomes the state versus Patrick Murphy, which sounds like a really cool TV movie. But it becomes the state versus Patrick Murphy. And so now the state has intervened as a proxy for me, as a means of dealing with you. And the question then becomes, who did it and how do we punish them, rather than who was harmed and how do we make them whole again? And because of that, because we lack a kind of restorative model of thinking about justice, our only understanding of justice is punishment, and our only understanding of punishment is confinement. And for that, we need to interject the state in all of our interactions. And so what I want us to think about is, how can we involve the state more in terms of creating a social safety net? But how can we pull the state out, move the state out, so that we can create social relationships and community building and forms of conflict resolution, violence interruption, treatment, care, therapy, that allow us to function as healthy communities without involving the state, whose primary function, again, is the hammer. Yeah.
Thank you. We've got a lot of activity, both in terms of chat and hands up. Tom, you've had your hand up for a while there, so I'll let you jump in. And then, sorry, Jesse and Josh, try and get there. And then, Marc, you can see some in the chat if you want to field those, maybe.
Okay, I haven't been following the chat, so I won't be able to reference that in asking my question, but I can reference Clemencia's question, which is very similar. So Marc, maybe you can just say, ditto in your answer. Anyway, thanks for your comments. Obviously, very, very interesting and rich, and it's hard to focus on one part. And the calls for imagination and restorative justice and so on it's all great stuff. I'm interested, going back to Clemencia's remark, to the concept of corona capitalism, and the idea of disposable citizens. And let me make a historical reference. Marx had argued that capitalism required the complete immiseration of the proletariat, as you will know, the poor. And however, in the late 1970s, Brazilian dependency theorist Fernando Cardoso had argued that Marx was wrong. He said that capitalist democracies had evolved such that they did not need to immiserate all the proletariat, but rather could simply ignore 20 or 30% of them. So that was his a form of arguing that capitalism didn't need to immiserate anybody, it just dispose of them, ignore them. So this argument was celebrated as explaining an important empirical fact, but criticized for being soft on capitalism, which he accepted but wanted to improve. And this is where it gets back to Clemencia's sort of question. So my question is corona capitalism a critique against capitalism as such, or is it a critique of a kind of capitalism which allows for and would therefore support a better form of capitalism, such as can be found in Scandinavian countries or even in newly imagined forms of society where markets nevertheless still play an important role, or must markets go completely? So
that's a great question.
You ask it, you talk about imagining a new politics, but what about imagining a new economics? So
it's a great question, and in the book I get at some of that by saying so let me start by saying it is a critique of capitalism as such, right? I would argue that there is no form of capitalism that will not lead to the exploitation or evisceration or disposability of vulnerable populations. And in the context of the United States, which is built on racial capitalism, it invariably leads to this to not just the disposability, but the kind of elimination of Black and brown folk. And so I begin there. But the specifics of corona capitalism in terms of I start from that place, and I would agree with Cardoso's argument to the extent that you don't have to completely eviscerate those people, but they become, like you said, ignored. And in the United States, that form of ignoring them comes through their erasure, right? And we've seen that over the last 40 years, right? Mental institutions were shut down at the end of the Carter administration into the Reagan administration. And people who were in mental facilities, for example, are now on the street. And then we create a bunch of laws that make it illegal to be on the street. And so we've essentially transcarcerated folk from mental institutions to prisons, right? Drug addiction happens, right? People were self-medicating, crack hits the streets. We intensify our war on drugs. So we've essentially criminalized mental illness. And so we moved, as Loïc Vacan talks about, from a social and medical state to a penal state. And so that becomes our particular mechanism of erasure, which also becomes another form of extraction, of capitalist extraction and labor exploitation, which has happened since the times of slavery, right? Which then turned into Black codes, which turned into a convict lease system, which turns into all these other systems where human captivity through various means becomes the mechanism for exploiting a particular class of not just proletariat, but often even we also see the lumpenization of that proletariat, right? Which becomes another piece of this as we move from 230 million incarcerated to 2.5 million incarcerated. It's not because people did more crime or did committed more harm. It's through the process of criminalization, right? Which is to say, as I argue in the book, that people don't commit crimes, they commit acts, and certain acts get criminalized. And that process becomes part of that erasure. But then there becomes this other piece that you ask about, which is for me is a more pragmatic question, right? I would argue that ultimately we won't have any semblance or possibility for a democracy until we dismantle this particular mode of production. And that's why I say it is a critique of capitalism as such. Yeah. However, Corona capitalism speaks to the particular formation of power at this juncture in history that has made the markets even more dangerous, even more, that's made power even more concentrated. So if one were to say that I believe that I am am a Fabianist, right? I'm a revolutionary socialist of the chair, right? And I'm just going to let this thing play out for the next 40 years. This could still be a useful argument. If someone were to say that I am a social democrat or a democratic socialist, and we could split hairs on what those things mean, they could still, this analysis would still be helpful for thinking about how to keep the excesses of corporations at arm's length. And if someone were a pure dyed-in-the-wool, revolutionary socialist, they would read. I think they could use this analysis as well. Where I sit personally is to say, ultimately, we need to dismantle this system. But the legitimacy or the usefulness of this framework, I don't think hinges upon that particular that particular approach.
Right. Great. Thank you very much. Interesting.
No, thank you. Thank you for that question.
Good question, Tom. Mark, if you can hang on a few more moments with us, we're running out of time, but there's some great questions.
Maybe we could take like 2 more.
Okay. Why don't we start with Rosie's in the chat? She says, what are your thoughts on the reemergence of mutual aid networks in response to the lack of safety net in the US? How do we hold both the belief in our community takes care of each other, i.e. not relying on the government or police because they've failed us, while also advocating for a new system, so trusting that we can build something better and involving the state more?
Yeah, that's a hell of a question, and it's the tension that we always wrestle with, right? And I can tell you, so on the first hand, the idea, the abolitionist vision that Quakers that imagined in the 70s, it was built on 5 points, most of which I've already talked about. But the 5th point is the emergence of the beloved community. And that is the emergence of mutual aid networks, mutual care networks, saying that we as communities can support each other and that we don't need the state to intervene in those interactions. But the tension in that, of course, is that we are citizens, right? And the state should intervene, right? It just shouldn't intervene in those particular ways. And so I think part of what we have to do is, as we begin to articulate our ethical and moral vision for what we want our interactions to look like, we want our communities to look like, then we can then have a clearer idea of what role the state can play. Now, there are some of us, myself included, who are skeptical and wary of nation states as such, right? And so for me, the state, it's the modern nation state itself brings upon a certain kind of violence. It necessitates a certain kind of plunder and erasure and violence that I think is unavoidable. And so for me, limiting the role, so for me to imagine the state intervening in a different way would force us to imagine an entirely new sort of framework. And for those of you who say, well, you can't live without a state, the modern nation state is a relatively new thing, right? And so again, these things, and this goes back to my interaction with Clemencia earlier, right? Is that you can enter these moments where suddenly you believe that there's no world outside of this one. But think about prior to World War I, right? I mean, the idea of the modern nation state is relatively new, but now it's almost impossible for us to think outside of it. So I think for us to get to where Rosie's talking about in her wonderful question, we have to, again, conjure the kind of moral and ethical vision and ambition to say, hey, there's another world out there. There's another social formation that's possible. And I'll be honest with you, I don't have the answer right now, but too often that becomes the excuse for not dreaming, right? That, that it's like, oh, well, unless you can come up with a solution for why, what to do with the serial killer right now, we can't talk about abolition. If you can't think of an alternative to the nation state right now, then we can't dream of new worlds. And I'm saying we have to do that work. We have to kind of build the plane as we fly.
Thank you. That is a wonderful response. Jesse, you've been waiting there, and we want to honor Dr. Hill's time. So I think this will probably be the last question. Teg, I'm sorry for keeping you on the hook there.
I'll answer Tay's too.
Okay.
I feel bad keeping anyone on the hook.
And we'll roll out. Thank you.
I'll just answer more quick. Maybe you both ask them. I'm feeling a weird synergy between you two, and I think your questions will dovetail and overlap in such a way that I'll be able to answer them at the same time.
Hi, so I'm a reporter from the Temple News, and we're covering this event. And my first question was, do you think social media helps raise awareness on issues such as social injustice, or is it just a way for white people to kind of rid their guilt? And then my follow-up question would be, what next steps should like young activists like in the Temple community take?
Great. No, that's great. Go ahead, and T.
Yeah, to take the next steps towards the abolitionist future that you described in your book.
No, I'm going to take both questions now, and then
Oh, okay.
Yeah. Hi. So my question is, with what has happened in the past year involving injustice, are you optimistic about the future of our country? And what are your thoughts on how police could probably de-escalate situations safely involving people with mental health crises without like using like their gun or something?
That's a great question. And they do connect, so I'll answer them both. I'm not optimistic. Optimism for me is almost like optimism implies a kind of belief that things will work out, that things will be okay. I prefer to think about myself as a prisoner of hope, right? Hope involves action. Hope involves a recognition of the obstacles. Hope does not have a sense of inevitability attached to it. Hope is sober. And hope understands that we may have to reshape the world that we're in and reimagine it. I think about Du Bois in his chapter on the passing of the firstborn, where he talked about a hope, not hopeless, but unhopeful. That's sort of where I am. And so do I think that we can reshape this world? Absolutely, but we need to do, there's a certain kind of work we have to do of dismantling the current system. That means not asking, and I appreciate your question, but not asking, can we prepare police to not, can we prepare police to not kill mentally ill people, right? That's an important question. And yes, we can train police better. We can use better tactics. But what I want us to do is have a more radical and ambitious freedom dream to say that let's have a world where our needs are met so that, and I don't mean like an idealistic thing where no one's mentally ill, and because I also don't want to demonize or pathologize the mental illness, right? Because that's not the problem. The problem is that people's needs aren't being met. And I don't believe that an armed police force can meet those needs. And so for me, it's figuring out how we can disarm and defund police and how we can replace them with other systems that can meet those needs. So yes, we could make nicer police, just like we could have warmer and fuzzier prisons, right? But I'm saying, let's imagine new possibilities. And then the question becomes, well, how do we do that? And which takes me also to Jesse's question, right? And I think it's to act. You know, I don't think that people sometimes say, particularly activists of my age and older, say social media isn't real activism. Oh, yes, it is. When that woman screamed, "You about to lose your job" to that police officer, that's a certain kind of work. When people found Amy Cooper's job and got her fired for what she did to Christian Cooper in Central Park, that's a certain kind of work. The campaign we did to find Breonna, to get justice for Breonna Taylor is a certain kind of work, even though I disagree with using the police as the courts as the mechanism of justice. I still believe that the action works. So social media, and I think sometimes when we say social media isn't real or isn't real action, and it's just a place, to your point, to make white people feel good about themselves. Some of that is about that. Just like it sometimes makes Black people feel good about themselves. I did something, I changed my avatar, I changed my profile pic. Yeah, cool, but there has to be organized action. But I don't want to reduce organized action to being on the ground marching. One, it can become ableist, right? Two, it can ignore the epistemologies of the moment, right? I mean, think about like the Socratic dialogues, right? Think about was it the Meno? No, it wasn't the Meno. It was Euthyphro, I believe, where Socrates himself is saying that he's saying the book isn't a legitimate form of engagement. You know, Socrates was in the dialogue, as we all know, right? And so Socrates was saying this book isn't useful because you can't ask the author anything, right? There was a way that the book as technology was being dismissed because it didn't have the capacity to do the work and the kind of on the ground work that Socrates thought that it could do, or Plato. What's my point? My point is that every generation has these tensions around text. Every generation has these tensions around whether this new form of knowing, whether it's the radio, the TV, the flyer, all these, I mean, the printing press, all these things have created tensions. And so I don't want to be that person now, you know, who says, well, in my day, real activism was we handed out flyers. Well, you're just doing a mass DM, cool, right? And I talk about this in the book, right? That's okay, right? Fundraising without passing around a coffee can, but instead doing a GoFundMe might be useful. But I also don't want to diminish the work of people on the ground and talk about the real need to connect and engage people, but it may look differently. And the way to do that for the Temple community, I think, is to organize. Being an activist is cool. I've been an activist since I was literally walking up and down my Uncle Bobbie's house right across the street from my office at Temple, right? But we have to organize. We have to join organizations. We have to build organizations. We need structured, organized action to respond. Organized people defeat organized power. If we want to defeat whatever forces are out in the world that we think are causing us to be poor, that are causing racism to persist, that are causing anti-Semitism to linger, that cause homophobia to be present, that normalize rape culture, whatever the thing is that we want to dismantle, we have to organize against it. And so for you students out there, don't just start an organization. Every student I meet wants to start a nonprofit or start an organization. Join something, be a part of something, be a part of a bigger community. And if we do that, I think we have the capacity to win. I think victory is closer than it's ever been.
Thank you, Professor Hill. Thank you, everyone, for joining us today. This was a rare treat. We got 2 books in an hour. It was really provocative and I think inspiring, particularly in terms of just thinking about a vision for the future that is more progressive and that invites us to rethink those things that sort of we already are embedded in and meshed in ourselves. Please join us next week. Thank you again for your time, and everyone, thank Dr. Hill for his time with us today. Appreciate it. Be safe.